The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started with today's webinar, Cybersecurity Resolutions for the New Year. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Williams. I'm a partner with Polaro Mazza in our government contracts group. Polaro Mazza is a law firm in Washington, D.C. We represent primarily government contractors, small and mid-sized firms. I personally do a lot of work with small business procurement programs, bid protests, joint ventures and subcontracts, and a lot of other things that contractors encounter when they do business with the federal government. And one area in particular that has been coming up with increasing frequency recently is cybersecurity. And that's why I'm very excited to have with me today Steve Chaffetz. Steve is the president of END USA, and he's going to join me for this webinar.
Thanks, John. EN specializes in keeping government and non-government entities in compliance with a variety of federal regulations. And we do that by destroying data on equipment that's taken out of service, which we'll be talking about later, and also we recycle end-of-life equipment. So protecting data and recycling equipment taken out of service has become extremely important, and we hope you learn a lot about it this afternoon.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for being here. So let's start off talking about where we're going to go today. And you'll see here loading up in a moment our overview slide. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the outset talking about why cybersecurity matters. You know, why should this be on your radar as a small or mid-sized government contractor? And I think most of our audience falls into that category. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some recently implemented rules and laws and some things that may be coming down the pike soon regarding cybersecurity. So if you haven't seen this in your contracts yet or in your agreements with partners, we'll talk about some reasons why you're probably going to be seeing this soon. And then I'll kick it over to Steve, and he'll spend some time talking to you about handling end-of-life equipment and data taken out of service. He's also going to talk to you about HIPPA and interesting ways that cybersecurity issues intersect with your obligations under HIPPA. And we'll also talk with you, both of us will, at the end, to leave you some practical tips or what we're calling New Year's resolutions for your business for cybersecurity practices. And the goal here is to land somewhere around 1:45 or so that we can have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions. You've got the question box, so you should see it on your dashboard. Just go ahead and type in the questions as they occur to you throughout the presentation. Type in as many as you want, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And if we run out of time and aren't able to answer your question, we will email you afterwards to follow up. So everybody's question will get answered, so feel free to fire away. And also wanted to let you guys know that a copy of our slides will be emailed to you after the presentation's over with, and the slides as well as the audio is going to be posted to our website at www.polaromazza.com, as well as our YouTube channel probably within the next day or so. So if anybody's interested in having these slides or the audio afterwards, there'll be a couple places you can get it. And of course you can always contact us too if you can't find them. Okay, so why does cybersecurity matter? You know, I mean, you're hearing a lot about this, and it's certainly been in the news very recently. But why does it matter to you? You know, like I mentioned in my brief bio, I and we do a lot of work with small and mid-sized government contractors. And one issue that they're not talking about very much is cybersecurity. It just does not come up a lot in the conversations we have with our clients. And this started to become an area of interest for us within the last several months when we realized, you know, there's a lot of rulemaking and legislation going on related to cybersecurity, and our client base isn't talking about it. And I suspect that that is largely due to the fact that small businesses in general don't think that they're a target, that they need to be concerned about cybersecurity. You know, we say here on the slide, you know, we're small, we're not Sony Pictures. You know, North Korea isn't going to try to get into my network. But, you know, the data suggests that you should think again on that, because small businesses are subject to nearly half of all cyber attacks. And, you know, in a cyber incident or a cyber attack, it's not just a North Korea going after a Sony Pictures or a, you know, Russian crime syndicate. It can be a former employee. It can be a disgruntled current employee. And, you know, they can come in and wreck your network, shut you down, steal your data, you know, plant some kind of a malware and really disrupt your business. And so, you know, and that's much closer to home than the stuff you hear about in the news. And it's happening with more frequency. And the government has caught on to this. And the government realizes that the smaller firms are potentially a weaker link in the supply chain. That, you know, this has been publicized enough to this point that larger firms, particularly, you know, with significant resources, have generally very robust cybersecurity and general security practices and protocols and programs. But smaller firms, by and large, do not, for resources issues and maybe because they think it's not as important to them. And so the government knows that, the cyber criminals know that, and you're seeing that small businesses are increasingly viewed as a riper target for cyber issues. And that's something that as a small business or mid-sized contractor you need to keep in mind when you're weighing the importance of really getting up to speed and preparing for cybersecurity issues. Inadequate cybersecurity or a cyber incident can have a lot of adverse consequences, some of which you may not consider. And this is another reason why paying attention to cybersecurity matters. It's not just the time and money it causes to fix the problem. I mean, it's certainly potentially loss of data. When we get a few slides down the road, we'll talk about some of the new government rules and legislation that could result in termination of contracts when you have a cyber incident, adverse past performance or responsibility determinations. I mean, the worst case scenario could be False Claims Act liability and suspension and debarment. So there are a lot of potentially adverse consequences of not paying enough attention to this issue. And I wanted to note one recent case that actually Steve brought to my attention out of Connecticut, this Emily Byrne case noted on here. And I think this case is interesting because it involved a doctor's office that was sued by a patient because the doctor's office, their medical records were breached in a cyber attack, and this particular patient's records were taken. And this is an area, Steve will get into this when he talks about HIPAA later in the presentation, but you know, that was a HIPAA issue because the doctor's office is obligated to protect those types of records. But HIPAA itself doesn't provide for a private right to sue. So this patient couldn't sue the doctor's office under HIPAA for damages. But what the patient did was they sued the doctor's office for negligence. And the standard of care that they used for their negligence claim was the failure to abide by HIPAA. And this case hasn't been resolved. There's not a final judgment. It's still, I think, bouncing around the court system a little bit, at least the last that I heard about it. But it's interesting to me because I think it suggests, with a little bit of creativity, how plaintiffs' lawyers can use cyber incidents or lack of cybersecurity to go after companies for damages. Okay, so as the slide changes over here, we'll start to talk about the first of a few rulemakings that I want to bring to your attention. This one is called the Safeguarding Unclassified Controlled Technical Information, or UCTI. And there's a DFARS on this. It's cited here, and this rule became effective in November 2013. So it's been around for a little while now. DoD just issued some guidance on this rule last December 2014, so we're starting to get a little bit better idea of how they interpret this and what their expectations are. But it's still relatively new, and I want to make sure everyone knows about it, and in particular because it's required for all new DoD contracts and subcontracts. So if you are a DoD contractor, and you very well have this DFARS clause in your contract right now. And that could be as a prime or a sub, because you have to flow this clause down to subcontractors. And unlike some other requirements where there's an exemption if you're a small business, there is no exception for small businesses or for commercial items. So if whether you're a small business or not, you would be subject to this requirement. And the primary requirements are that you provide adequate security to safeguard UCTI on your unclassified information systems. And then the other big component of it is that you have to report cyber incidents that affect UCTI within 72 hours and to preserve information to aid a government investigation. So protection, adequate security, and reporting, the two big components. And they're a non-compliance, because this is a clause in your contract. Non-compliance could be a breach of contract that could have several adverse consequences, including a default termination. And then if you get terminated for default, the government can go after you for damages. So that's sort of a quick overview of this rule. And then let's talk about let's drill down a little bit on some more of the specifics. So what is UCTI? I've got this is the definition from the DFARS. It's technical data or computer software with military or space application that's subject to controls. And we say generally it relates to sensitive information subject to marking and release restrictions the government will identify. So what that means is the government should really tell you if information is considered to be UCTI, tell you through how it's marked. So it shouldn't be difficult for you to discern whether you have UCTI, although it could be. And in particular, if under a new contract you're being asked to develop UCTI, then that statement of work or that contract should give you guidance on how you should be marking the data. What is adequate security, I think, is we have some guideposts, but it's somewhat vague, and this is the key. What do you need to be doing in order to comply, to avoid the adverse consequences we talked about? And there's this vague phrase that you must provide protective measures commensurate with the consequences and probability of loss. Well, I don't exactly know what that means, but the rule goes on. It's you got to do as much as you needed to do, basically. But the rule does get a little more specific and tell you to adhere to 51 security controls from the National Institute for Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53. So NIST 853 has got a lot of security controls, procedures in it. This rule has a chart that designates 51 of them, and it says this is sort of the baseline for what you should be doing to provide adequate security. Although you don't necessarily have to implement and follow all 51 of those particular security controls from NIST 800-53, the rule does give some flexibility for you to say, well, I don't think these particular controls are applicable to me, or I don't think they're necessary because of something else you're doing or the nature of your of your business. So at least if you're in that scenario, you need to at least explain why it is that you're not using all 51 of the recommended controls, and it's just a baseline. So it may be that for your circumstances, you need to do more than that. Yeah, and we noted here that the government is not going to come in and give like a pre-approval of your system to say you're giving adequate security. So you have to use a good faith effort to comply. And they would come in after the fact, and so it's a reasonable person to have you followed the regulations in good faith, attempting to comply with as best as you understand what they're telling you need to do. And in terms of what is a cyber incident, well, that's not entirely clear either. It appears that it's going to cover intentional use of a computer network to obtain information, which we would call hacking, even if that attempt was unsuccessful. And it also appears to cover inadvertent releases of UCTI. So you didn't necessarily get hacked by somebody, but you had some kind of inadvertent disclosure of UCTI. So another DFARS rule I want to make sure everybody is aware of is another one that was released in November 2013 regarding supply chain security. And this created a pilot program that's going to run for the next several years for DoD to assess the impact of risk in their supply chain. And again, this goes back to this point I made earlier about small businesses being viewed now increasingly as the weak link, or at least concerns in the supply chain that the larger companies the DoD deals with, probably have more robust systems in place at this point. So the attackers are going to try to find the weakest link. And so this particular rule, it's geared towards covered systems, and we've got the definition of what a covered system is here. And it's not necessarily just government systems. I think this could include a contractor system or telecommunications providers. And notably, this clause, this DFARS clause, has to be included in all IT procurements that are subject to the DFARS. And it has to be flowed down to subcontractors. So if you're in the IT space, and even if you're not a prime to DoD, if you're a subcontractor to a DoD prime, that in the IT space, you may find, if you haven't found it already, you may find that prime contractor is trying to flow this clause down to you. And then the questions you should be asking are, well, does this really apply to me? And if it does, what do I need to do? So the upshot of this rule is to exclude a contractor from a procurement if that contractor is a supply chain risk. So, it does not have adequate security. And that could happen if you fail to meet certain qualification standards, or if you don't get an acceptable rating. They could make the supply chain risk an evaluation factor. DoD can also direct a prime contractor to exclude a subcontractor. So, that's where, again, even if you're not doing work directly with DoD, if you're a subcontractor, you could get excluded from a particular contract or from, and I think some of the areas of this rule that are of most concern for us is that there's limited disclosure of these exclusion decisions. And they're unreviewable in bid protests. So there's not going to be a whole lot of sunshine on those decisions, although fortunately they do have to go through several hoops before they can be issued. And the question that we've been asking and has been asked is, what's going to happen to these exclusion decisions? Are they going to be made available through CPARS or SAM.gov or otherwise reported to agencies that can effectively become a de facto debarment? Say, we excluded you because we thought you were too risky, and then other agencies say, oh, okay, well maybe we should exclude them too. All right, so now for the next couple of slides, I'm going to run through several legislative developments related to rapid reporting of cyber attacks. And we talked about that the UCTI rule has a requirement to report cyber incidents within 72 hours. So we've already got something out there on rapid reporting, but I think we're going to see more of that. It's going to apply more broadly. For example, the 2013 NDAA has a provision where they're expecting rules to be implemented in early 2013. We just haven't seen them yet. But the 2013 NDAA says that the DoD should be requiring clear contractors to rapidly report successful cyber attacks and assist government investigations. And I think the thought is that this is also going to require the contractors to give a lot of information to DoD and maybe access to their systems, and so there's some concerns there about what is that going to look like, that the government comes in and gets to sort of reverse engineer what happened, and what kind of access do they have, and what exactly do we have to report? We just don't know yet because that's still percolating. But something else similar on the next slide. A law was passed in July 2014, and it's very similar to the 2013 NDAA. I mean, it applies to a different segment of the contractor community. Here we're talking about intelligence community contractors, but very similar again. The idea is to develop procedures for reporting penetration of intelligence community networks. This one is also going to require a network security plan for all intelligence community contracts. And there's a lot that still needs to be worked out about exactly how this is going to be implemented. We don't have the rules yet, just like the 2013 NDAA. So we're in a wait and see mode, but we know this is coming. And then more recently, the 2015 NDAA, there is a provision in there that requires DoD, again within 90 days, to develop procedures for rapid reporting of incidents experienced by operationally critical contractors. So now we're defining another segment of the contractor community that's going to be subject to rapid reporting requirements. And where have we heard this before about the within 90 days? I don't know that we should all hold our breath that by the end of March we're going to see these. But there's a significant potential for overlap in all of these requirements. So it's going to be interesting to see how they work this out. And I think there's a risk that we're going to have several similar but not entirely the same sets of reporting obligations, and which is only going to make it more complicated and costly for contractors to try to determine, well, what am I subject to? Who am I reporting to here? What am I supposed to do? So they've got to work out how they're going to harmonize these different laws that have been passed recently, and there's only more coming down the pike. And this next slide is, there was a NIST special publication released in November. The upshot of this is that it's expected to yield a FAR clause. So you may be sitting there thinking, well, I don't do a lot of DoD or any DoD work, so is this really relevant for me? Because John's just talking about a bunch of DFARS provisions and cleared contractors and et cetera. And I think it is relevant for you, maybe not at this moment, but what we're seeing in the DFARS and in these laws I just talked about, that very well may be what ends up in the FAR, something like that, and with rapid reporting requirements and security protocol requirements. That I think it's there's enough of a groundswell for a FAR clause that applies more broadly, and we're not just talking about DoD contractors. We don't have that yet, but I think that's something we should expect is coming soon. And one last point I want to mention before I turn it over to Steve is some more recent developments. The Sony hack, everybody's heard about that, and of course, when you have something big like that in the news, it tends to drive immediate press conferences and releases, and everybody calls to action, and we'll see how it all shakes out. But there was one law that was tried a couple years ago, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act, that it didn't ultimately get through. I think it passed the House and failed the Senate because it concerned over privacy. And this is, we want private entities to share data to help prevent cyber attacks, and we're going to give them exemptions from lawsuits over that. And so privacy groups are really concerned about the scope of the information that will be shared with the government. I mean, you can see both sides of it. We want to stop these cyber attacks. We want to maintain privacy. So how do we weave those cones? And the White House in 2013 signaled it wasn't really in favor of this CISPA because of the privacy concerns. But a couple of days ago, actually I guess it was yesterday, President Obama unveiled that he's pushing new cybersecurity legislation, and it has some of the hallmarks of this CISPA. So it'll be interesting to see how this works out and if they're able to actually get something through. But you can see that the wheels are turning, at least in response to what happened with Sony, and that's just an indication that this isn't going, the cybersecurity issues aren't going away anytime soon.
Thanks, John. Many of you may not be covered by any of the things that John spoke about, but what I'm going to speak about is what all of you need to be concerned with, and that's the protection of data, and also to prevent being fined for not being in compliance with a lot of the regulations we'll be talking about. I'm going to be speaking about HIPAA. However, you can just assume what I'm talking about HIPAA also relates to your company. Whatever type of business you're in, you're going to have to meet these same requirements to protect a data breach. All of you have equipment that you've taken out of service, which we refer to as end-of-life equipment. And it could be a variety of things. And what you do is you store them someplace. You have a requirement to properly recycle them, and some states are making that mandatory. You don't want to put it in a dumpster. You can't let it go to a landfill. And when you let's leave it sitting in a corner, it creates the potential for a data breach. Obviously, I haven't been in any of your offices, but I'm willing to bet that at least 90% of you have computers, printers, and copy machines sitting in a hall, sitting in a vacant office, or sitting in a storage room. And all of that equipment retains data, and those are the things that you want to protect. You have servers, and you're spending a significant amount of money to prevent intrusion into your network, because everyone wants to get to your hard drive that has the data. But when you take that server out of service or take computers out of service, the same information that you spent so much time protecting is now sitting unsecure in a hallway. That creates a significant potential for theft and a breach. One of the things you need to do, you have to assume that all equipment retains data. It's not just PCs and servers. Copy machines, printers, laptops, medical equipment, even phone systems retain data. And you're responsible to safeguard the data. And if you're not in compliance, there's going to be some serious penalties, and that's some of the things that John was alluding to, because there's going to be a significant focus on cybersecurity. In a recent breach report, 68% of data theft was inside. It was from theft. It wasn't from hackers. So how do you prevent the breach? Well, the first thing you need to do, you have to assign responsibility to people that are going to take care of the machines that have the data. Then you have to remove and secure the data and hold it for proper sanitization or destruction. A company that was leasing a copy machine returned the copy machine to the vendor sold the machine, and there were significant amount of records on the hard drive, and that company was sued, or actually fined, $1.2 million. And that could have been easily eliminated had they had someone go through the equipment and take the hard drive out. there's a good chance they may not have been aware that there was a hard drive in it. Whatever your business is, you're collecting what's referred to as personal identifiable information, or PII. In the healthcare industry, it's electronic protected health information. Whatever business you're operating, you're collecting personal identifiable information from your clients, from your employees, and anyone that you're dealing with. And there's scores of federal regulations that require you to safeguard the data. HIPAA, we're all aware of. When we go to a doctor's office, we sign something, and the doctor makes certain they're not going to give the information to somebody without your permission. John alluded to a lawsuit that happened in Connecticut, and that healthcare provider was sued. Sarbanes-Oxley relates to publicly held corporations. Gramm-Leach-Bliley, if you're in a bank situation, you're obligated to conform to that. The Fair and Accurate Credit Trading Act, anybody that collects credit information, it could be an auto dealer, it could be a bank. You could even be collecting credit information about your employees. You're covered. Actually, you have to follow a FACTA regulation. FISMA, which is obviously related to the federal government and the DoD contractors, and the Child Online Protection Act. That's data that you may collect from children, online. If you think hard, you're going to fall under one of these categories. Oops. When we talk about HIPAA, as I mentioned, whatever your business, you have to follow the same guidelines. And if you follow the guidelines, you'll be in compliance with regulations that require you to safeguard the data. HIPAA has a very specific implementation rule for the disposal of electronic media. And I'll read it. It's implement policies and procedures to address the final disposition of electronic protected health information and or the hardware or electronic media on which it is stored. If you replace electronic media and just substitute your company's name, you have to abide by these. And if you have specific policies and procedures set up, you won't have to worry about having a data breach. If you don't have policies and procedures set up, you have significant potential for a data breach. With respect to HIPAA, there's going to be a lot more enforcement this year, and the fines have increased from $25,000 per incident to $1,500,000 per incident. And let me give you an example of what happened when someone didn't store or protect hard drives. Blue Cross Blue Shield in Tennessee was storing hard drives in a storage room. 57 hard drives were stolen. They had to pay a fine to HIPAA of $1.5 million. But by the time they were done settling everything they needed to do to remedy the situation, it cost Blue Cross Blue Shield over $18 million. And the average cost of a data breach today is $3.5 million, which is up 15% from 2013. Medical records are in the highest demand for identity thieves. You can buy a credit card record, which you could use to buy something over the internet. You can buy it for $1. Medical records go for as high as $50. So that's the reason you really have to spend a significant amount of energy protecting the data for HIPAA compliance. Another thing, 25% of data breaches come from corporate entities. 46% come from HIPAA breaches, and the rest is from education and government. So a large percentage of the breaches are coming from people just like yourself for not adequately securing the data. So what are the resolutions for compliance to make certain that you don't have a data breach? Well, the first thing you need to do is create written policies and procedures and make certain they're followed. You really need to designate someone responsible for taking the data out of the equipment you remove from service. The National Institute of Standard and Technology has a very specific guideline, and it was just updated in December, and it tells you how to delete data or sanitize data from a hard drive. Many people feel deleting the file, reformatting the hard drive, or drilling a hole in the hard drive removes the data. In all of those cases, the data can be recovered. To do it properly, you really need to have someone that's certified to destroy the data and guarantee it cannot be recovered by any means whatsoever. And you can't really rely on your IT department, not because they're not good. That's not their primary mission. Their mission is to keep the network up, operating, have patches in. And what invariably happens, hard drives will end up in the IT room waiting for them to have time. And if they had 300 hard drives and it took 3 hours to sanitize the drives, that's a significant amount of time. And finally, your IT department can't self-certify. They can't certify that they have destroyed the data. You need to have someone who's an independent third party that has the ability to do that. So what do you need to do? You need to locate a vendor that can provide the certification that the data is 100% destroyed. When recycling equipment, you're responsible. If you call 1-800-GOT A TRUCK and they take your equipment and they dispose of it improperly, you are still responsible. So you need to make certain someone that you're using has one of the two internationally recognized certifications, and that's R2 2013 or E-Stewards. That guarantees that 100% of the material is properly recycled and none of it ends up in a landfill. If you're involved in a HIPPA environment, you must enter into a business associate agreement. A business associate is anyone that the healthcare provider provides information to a third party. As an example, if a doctor's office wanted to convert their paper records to electronic records, the contractor doing that would be a business associate. If my company removed hard drives from your equipment, took it back to our facility to destroy the data, we would be a business associate. And what the business associate agreement does, it obligates the associate not only to safeguard the data, they have to exercise the same standard of care that you had to exercise, and they have to make certain that they cannot disclose the information to anyone unless it's directed by you. And if you're using proper third parties for data sanitization, and to get special certifications to do that, the people that do the physical work have to go through background checks, drug screening, and basically have a security clearance to the extent that you can rely on them to make certain the data is taken care of properly. You might want to consider breach insurance or cyber liability insurance. Many of the carriers today have data breach exclusions. And if you have a data breach and you're spending a lot of money for your insurance, don't assume you have coverage. And as I indicated, the fines can be significantly great, and once you get fined, you're not going to be able to argue your way out of it. The other thing real quick, and under HIPAA, the Attorney General of each state now is authorized to sue on behalf of HIPAA. So they have incentive. If there's a breach, they can sue the healthcare provider and they get to keep the funds. So to summarize, when you get equipment that's reached its end of its life, assume it has data on it that you have to protect, destroy the data properly, recycle it properly, and make certain that you're maintaining that standard at all times.
Thanks, Steve. I wanted to go back to the insurance point that he mentioned. I think that's a really great point and a good takeaway for everybody to check your existing policies. Talk to your broker if you aren't aware of or haven't considered this type of insurance, and depending on the nature of your business and how you're set up, what you're doing and what kind of data is transitioning through your systems, that may be something that's perfect for you to look at. And I actually was just talking with insurance company a couple of days ago about what they're offering, and I didn't realize everything that's out there from an insurance standpoint, from business interruption, property loss, crime loss exposures. You can get covered for people get unauthorized access and stealing of data, phishing, spamming, hacking. I mean, a whole host of things. So I think that's a great point. So along the lines of additional resolutions, takeaways and things to talk about at your next management team meeting or as you're planning and looking forward for this new year, be more introspective. And what I mean by that is conduct a data inventory. I think that's what the FCC has a lot of guidance on their website for small businesses planning oriented to cybersecurity. And they'll actually, if you go to fcc.gov/cyberplanner, you can pop in your information and kind of walk through a tutorial, and out of the other side of that you'll end up with a very basic but nevertheless a better than nothing cybersecurity plan. And but it's really just their guidance that they refashion as a plan. And I think this is a very good point that they make, that understand what you have. What kind of data are you storing and transitioning and working with? Because that's going to inform, from my standpoint, from the GovCon regulatory standpoint, that's going to inform, well, what do you need to do under these new rules that we talked about earlier, and the laws that are coming down the pike? Are you subject to them? And obviously, when we get a new FAR clause and a broader section of you guys are now going to be subject to the similar requirements, what is that going to mean? I mean, it may be for some of you that you can say, okay, I did this webinar and now I know, and I can file it away because this isn't that relevant for me. But I think that's going to become an increasingly smaller segment of the contractor community. And part of your introspection, what are you doing to protect your data currently, and who can access your systems and your data? I mean, is this on your radar? I think that's kind of what I want the takeaway to be. And assess what your internal policies and procedures are for safekeeping data and systems and incident response, and are you training your people on this? And then another area that's I think critical from our standpoint as counsel is what do your contracts say? And that goes both ways. When someone's offering you a contract, what are they requiring you to now rep to? Are you having to make additional representations now about the security of your system? Are you being asked to indemnify? And I'll come back to this a little bit in a later slide, but are you being asked to indemnify upstream or downstream partners for your incidents that may arise as a result of a breach in your system? And transition the way that you think about this, that not simply spending and resources you may devote to cybersecurity. Don't think about it simply in terms of return on investment, because we've talked about this earlier on the consequences slide, but your reputation and business development are potentially at stake. I mean, our partner's going to want to work with you if you have a publicized incident and you're viewed as a security risk. Is the government going to exclude you? And even if it's not a formal DFARS exclusion, I think we might start to see softer exclusions in the terms of adverse past performance and responsibility determinations geared towards these issues. So you take the time now to get this on your radar. You came to the webinar, and that's a good first step, at least. And you may be doing other things, but I think get this as to be part of your planning and on your radar, and ask these questions of yourself, of your business. And then make a plan. So you've asked the questions and you've done your introspection, and Steve mentioned this, and I think he was talking geared towards HIPAA, but in general, you need to have a company policy, and you need to have procedures for protecting your sensitive data. I mean, even if you don't have data that's covered by HIPAA or data that's covered by the DFARS clauses we talked about, your company has some sensitive data. If nothing else, it's your own trade secret and intellectual property information. So what's your policy and procedures for how you're protecting that stuff? Do you have any? And we've given you just some examples here of what procedures should look like or could look like. And it's going to be driven in part based on the nature of the data that you have. So, for example, the NIST 853 controls, obviously if you're subject to DFARS, that particular DFARS, you're going to have to pay a lot closer attention to that than maybe some other folks. But who has access to your data? What are your protocols for passwords, for changing passwords and complexity of passwords, encryption? What's your backup system like? How regularly and how are you backing up your critical data? What procedures do you have for reporting an incident? We talked about 3 laws and a DFARS clause in the brief time we have today. We're all geared towards making sure that contractors are quickly reporting cyber incidents, and there's going to be more of that kind of stuff coming down the pike. So best to get out in front of that now and understand internally, how are we going to handle this if we have an incident? How do we report it? Who's responsible? What's the chain of escalation? What are our, how quickly are we expecting our folks to jump on these issues? Control physical access to your computers and your networks. What are your policies and procedures for that? Who can get access to your computers, and how are you limiting that? It may seem common sense, but regularly update antivirus software security patches, your firewalls, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's front lines of defense for cybersecurity related concerns. Stopping intrusions and detecting possible thefts. You need to, and those would be some of the low-hanging fruit, but the very much expected steps for you to take to have a robust cybersecurity plan. So that should definitely be a part of it. And then training. And I wanted to emphasize that at the end, that you need to sit your people down. Once you've got your policy and your procedures, you need to sit your people down and train them on it. I mean, the policy and procedure is only as good as your people understand it and implement it, and that you regularly check on it. So you should have as part of your procedures how you're going to do regular training and what you're going to train people on, and that they're signing off, documenting that they attended the training. And social media policy is one I know that's been a hot issue. What are our expectations, and how are we training people to when they're going out on the web and advancing the interests of our company, but are we doing it in the best way, and are we protecting our sensitive data, not giving it away or putting it in a place or in a way that people could take it. And then, of course, adverse consequences for non-compliance with the policies and procedures. I mean, you should make this a real issue for employees, a serious issue that they need to help you make sure that you're on top of. And finally, do unto others. And I said I would come back to the the notion of checking your contract, and that's really what I want to drill down on here. That you should have the same expectation of adequate security from your contracting partners and vendors as the government and other contractors are going to have from you. So when obviously, if you're subject to these DFARS clauses we talked about, you're going to have to flow that down to your subcontractors. So make sure your agreement clearly flows it down to the subcontractors. But you may want to go farther than just simply flowing down a DFARS clause to the subcontractor. You know, what can you put into your subcontracts and your joint venture agreements and teaming agreements and other arrangements that will give you the ability to monitor and enforce cybersecurity requirements over your partners? You know, that they have to demonstrate to you that they have and are implementing adequate security measures. You know, that they have to show you, if you ask for it, they'll show you proof. What exactly are they doing that you're requiring of them, what they need to be doing? And I think you ought to look at indemnification provisions that, you know, they tell you that they're going to adhere to certain flowed down security obligations, and they show you proof they're doing it, but as it turns out, they didn't live up quite to their obligations, and as a result there's a breach. That may have consequences for you, and what recourse do you have against the subcontractor in that scenario? These are things that you can plan ahead of time for in your subcontracts and joint venture agreements, etc. And again, there's going to be some government-driven requirements in these agreements, and then there's going to be some things that I think fall into the category of best practices that you just want to build into your contracting procedures now that, you know, this is, we know this isn't going away, and in fact it's just going to increase in significance as we move into the new year. So with that, we have concluded our presentation, and just want to thank everybody for joining us. And now I'm going to try to see if I can open up the questions here, and with the few minutes we have left, see if we can find a few questions to answer. Thanks everybody for submitting your questions, and feel free to keep sending them.
Yeah, the first one, I guess, is you. Okay. Well, one of the questions was, we purchased a hard drive degausser that was certified by all the regulatory controls such as HIPPA, PCI, etc. And we degauss in-house, then recycle with an e-Steward recycler. Is there a problem with this process? Well, one of the questions I would ask, in order to make certain you meet the requirements, you say that the degausser was certified. There's only one way you can be sure it's going to be in compliance. You have to have a degausser that's on the NSA evaluated list. If someone says it's certified, NSA does not certify degaussers, but to be in compliance, to make certain that the degausser has the magnetic strength to kill all the data, it has to be on that list. So if you just Google NSA equipment evaluated list, you'll see that. Another question is mobile devices. What do you do with regard to destroying data? Some people think that going to a factory reset will destroy all the data. It's like formatting a hard drive or deleting the files. You may not be able to recover the data by yourself. However, if there was someone that had forensic recovery capabilities, they're going to be able to do that. For the person that asked the question, just go to this website. It's WTHR.com, WTHR.com, and search for cell phone warning. And it talks about recovering a significant amount of personal data from cell phones that have been set to the factory reset. Okay, there's another question here. Can we easily identify the device in our office that stores data would fall under these regulations? Well, one of the ways to identify that is to know what type of equipment. And that would be obvious, a computer, a copy machine, believe it or not, a network printer, cell phones, medical equipment. If you're unsure and it's a new device, go to the owner's manual and it'll tell you if it has storage capabilities. But what people don't realize that almost all electronic devices in the office today retain data, even phone systems. Let's see what other questions that I can answer. What is a degausser? Well, data is put on a hard drive magnetically with read-write heads. And a degausser is a device that has a very high magnetic field that's greater than the force that was used to apply the data. Basically, it's a very, very strong magnet. And when you subject the hard drive to that very strong magnet, it will basically not only erase all the data, but destroy the hard drive. But getting back to the first question I answered, not all degaussers are powerful enough to destroy data on hard drives, and that's why you have to make certain they're on the NSA evaluated list.
I see one on here that says, how should these matters be reflected in our employee handbooks? And I would say that if you have your cybersecurity related policy and procedures, that the expectation of acknowledgement and compliance with that policy and procedures should be reflected in your handbook. So you're telling the employees in the handbook that you have these policies and policy and procedures, that the company takes it very seriously. The expectation is the employees are going to comply with it. You will be trained on it, and you'll be expected to adhere to it because it's a critical thing for the company. Somebody also asked, is UCTI the same as or a replacement of FOUO for official use only? No, it's not a replacement for FOUO, and it's not the same as either. You know, the FOUO is sort of a catch-all marking, and there was some commentary about this in the UCTI rulemaking, and I think it would be on a case-by-case basis to determine whether that would be considered a UCTI, FOUO would be considered a UCTI. And we did get a few questions about whether the slides would be available, or can we get the audio of the slides or get back to a particular slide. And we will be sending the full slides to all of the participants via email. That email is going to pop into your inbox fairly soon after the webinar is over with. And then if you check back on our website, www.poleromazza.com, give us about a day, and we'll get the audio and the slides uploaded on the presentations page of our website. So www.poleromazza.com, presentations. It'll also be on our YouTube channel. And I've got our contact information up here, so don't hesitate to shoot either Steve or me an email afterwards, a reminder that you want the slides and the audio. We'll make sure we get it to you. And if there's any other questions you didn't think of today that you want to ask, we're about out of time here. There are a few more questions, so we'll get back to everybody that we didn't answer here via email afterwards. But again, we thank everybody for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.